everyone. My name is Treblinka, and I'm a faculty member here in the School of Historical and Philosophical and Religious Studies. My great pleasure to welcome a former colleague of ours, Jacob Flaws, back to ASU. I will just introduce him quickly, and then we have maybe 55 minutes or so to talk about the books, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Dr. Jacob Flaws is an assistant professor of history at Kean University, where he teaches Holocaust and genocide studies and topics in modern European history. He's also a non-resident research fellow with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He is the author of the 2024 book, Spaces of Treblinka, Retracing a Death Camp, which he will be talking about today. Published with University of Nebraska Press. He's also the author of 2 journal articles related to the Holocaust and a chapter on German resettlers in the 2024 edited volume, The Eastern Front, War, Myth, and Memory, which was actually edited by a colleague of us, Jan Mann, in the World War II Studies program here at ASU. I would also like to put in, before Jacob starts talking, a quick plug. Tomorrow, we'll have a teacher training workshop facilitated by Kim Klett, who's here today, thankfully, and Lisa Marcio, who's a professor at Scottsdale Community College. This is a little bit our origin stories. Genocide Awareness Week was created by John Lifferton at Scottsdale Community before it moved here. And one of the big things that is important for us is also to train teachers to meet the mandate here in Arizona to teach the Holocaust and other genocides. And Kim is very much a facilitator of that together with Lisa Masio. So that's tomorrow at SEC. So without any further ado, Jacob, good to have you here.
Thanks, Volker. All right, well, thank you, Volker, for that kind introduction. And I want to start with just thanking everyone in the room for coming today, everyone online. It's a real pleasure to have been asked to come speak here at Genocide Awareness Week. I also want to just thank some people specifically, everyone on the Genocide Awareness Week team, the board that puts this together. It's a wonderful event, one that I was really familiar with and helped when I was here at ASU, and I was really thrilled to be invited to come talk about the book. So, but I want to single out, and I'll probably miss some people, but I want to say thanks to Tim Langell, Volker Bankert, who you just heard from, Hava Samuelson, Gloria Baker, Stan Mervis, the Rosenbluth family, and really everyone else who helped put this together. It's a wonderful event to raise awareness of genocide, and it truly is a nice way to bring a lot of different people together. And it's I wouldn't be here also without ASU Center for Jewish Studies and the help of Shippers, which is the organization putting and hosting us on today. So. But yes, I'm honored to speak today about my recent book that was a long time in the making, and it's kind of strange to see it in print, but always very cool. And so I'm really interested in your questions, though. So kind of keep in mind as you're going here things that I may bring up. I won't be able to cover the entirety of what's in the book, but I'm happy to highlight a few things and then really look forward to anything that you have that you might be interested in. So. The book itself started with 2 relatively simple questions that I had when I was visiting Treblinka and actually other camps in Poland a few years ago. What really struck me when I went to Treblinka for the first time and then again the second time is that there's nothing there of the camp. And there's this very moving memorial. It's 17,000, I think, stones jutting out of the ground as representative kind of headstones for the 800 to 900,000 people murdered in this space 80 years ago. But I had just been to both Auschwitz and Majdanek, pictured there on the left and on the left on the top. And both of those places have tangible remains, physical structures. You can see the Arbeitsmarktfrei Gate. You can see the barracks. If you go to Birkenau, you can see the ruins of the crematoria. At Majdanek, you can see the cattle barns, the barbed wires. It's very well preserved. So you get a real sense of what was there. And that made this contrast even more startling when I went to Treblinka, because I could not wrestle with the fact that there was nothing tangible linking me to this site. And so the question that popped up in my mind was a very simple one. It was, what was here 80 years ago? If I was standing in this exact spot, what would I have confronted? It was a lot easier to get there at the other two places. The other question that I kind of came up with was one that also impacted me at Majdanek. So if you look at Majdanek, in the background, I don't know if you can see the high-rise buildings, the telegraph wires. So at Majdanek, that's very clearly visible. The city of Lublin, which is about 100,000 people, lived there during the war. It's more than that now. Very, very visible from the camp to the city. Auschwitz, similar. The town of Auschwitz is right in the middle of the town or the camp is right in the middle of the town of Auschwitz. And so both of those camps were relatively witnessable. The idea of, well, who saw what, who knew what. And at Treblinka, it's a little more isolated, but I decided to get lost when I was there the last time. It seemed like it was in this rural forested area. And so I actually wandered off the memorial. I didn't know if I was supposed to do this, but I walked into those trees you see in the background and I wanted to see where it would take me. And I started to wander through the fields in the forest. And after about a kilometer, I ended up at this town called Volka. It's a small town, but it had a hospital, it had or a doctor's office, it had businesses, it had houses, it had life, it had people. And so the idea really struck me that, this really wasn't all that isolated either. There are many other towns around here. And so the second question that propelled this was who knew Treblinka was here, who saw what, who smelled what was this like? So I armed with these two questions, I set off on my research project that eventually became the book, simply what was here and who was able to actually witness these camps when they were operational. So when I got home, I started doing some research, and that's where I like to start now to give you all a sense of what Treblinka was in the historical setting, of what we actually know about it. Before I could actually understand what was here, I had to figure out what was there. As you're probably aware, the Nazi concentration camp system stretched all across Europe. As the map shows, there are camps literally all over Germany, the Protectorate, and the general government. And as the map also says, this is not all of the camps. They could simply not show all of them on a single map. In fact, it's probably not even 1/100th of the camps. We think there were about 44,000 different spaces used as camps or ghettos in the Third Reich. These camps had all sorts of different purposes. Some were forced labor, some were concentration camps, but really there was only 6 that we can attach the moniker death camp to. So those 6 are pictured here. Of that entire system, there are 6 camps that really stand alone for their purpose within the Holocaust. And within these 6, there's actually really only 3 that are true death camps. The purpose for people going there was to be put to death. So I'll start with the other 3, Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Chelmno, that you see pictured there. Auschwitz and Majdanek were hybrid camps. They had death camp components, but they also had large forced labor concentration camp components as well. So of course, Auschwitz, 1.1 million people were murdered, but we do have tens of thousands of survivors because not everyone went to the gas chambers. You're probably familiar with the picture of the guy at the end of the ramp saying, left, right, and some of the people got to work, some of them didn't. So we know a lot about Auschwitz because we actually have quite a few survivors. Same thing is true of Majdanek. 250,000 people were murdered, but again, we had a big work camp component. Chelmno doesn't fit neatly into any category. It's kind of an experimental death camp. They actually used mobile killing vans at that camp, but it never really functioned the way that Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka did. So at just those 3 camps alone, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, you had around 1.7 million people murdered in the span of just 18 months. So if we think about the Holocaust, the frenzy of mass killing, it really happened at those 3 camps. And within these 6 camps, you have around 3 million people killed. So literally half of the Holocaust deaths happen at just these 6 camps within that worldview. Of these camps, of especially the 3 that I mentioned, the Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka was arguably the nadir of the Holocaust, the dark core of what the Nazis were trying to do in terms of murdering people. 900,000 people were sent there and murdered. And this was not a camp with selections. The famous image of the person at the ramp selecting, that did not happen at Treblinka. That did not happen at Belzec or Sobibor either. But Treblinka was the camp the Nazis waited to build until the very end of this mass killing process. They wanted to perfect it. They wanted to make sure that this camp was the epitome of a mass death producing space. And because of that, we really don't have all that many survivors, so we don't know much about it. Of the 900,000 people killed at Treblinka, we know of 70 people who survived. And most of them came from an escape in 1942. Although research like mine is showing that number may be a little higher, that's not a great percentage of survivors versus people killed. Sobibor also had a revolt, and around 70 people survived versus around 250,000 killed. Belzec is a place where 600,000 people died and only 2 people survived. And so from the standpoint of what was knowable of these camps, these places become a kind of black hole in terms of what is happening there. Now, there is one exception, and I want to point this out before I move on. At Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, there is one group of people kept alive to work. And those are Jews who come off the trains, largely younger males. Their only right to life is to make sure the gas chambers are running efficiently. And they're rotated out every 3 weeks. And so there really is not much chance for people to survive. So from a historical standpoint, that is what Treblinka is. That's what we know about it. And we come to realize that we actually don't know all that much about this dark heart of the Holocaust. So with that in mind, I'd like to just give you a few takeaways that I think my book does a good service to. You know, the fact is that these are places that millions of people died, and we still don't have much written on it. The leading work on this is still from 1987. Yitzhak Arad's Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. It's 40 years old now. Great book, but I see myself as stepping into that conversation in a couple of ways. And so if you take anything away from kind of this perspective today, this is what I hope you do. The first question that I had was, you know, I was really impacted by the space, and I didn't know what that meant. I remember coming home and reading the facts I just showed you about how Treblinka worked in the universe of the Nazi camp system, how many people died there, the concrete things we knew. But I was really impacted by that idea of space and place. And even though I'm a historian, I had to change a little bit. I had to cross boundaries of disciplines. I had to go into geography. I started looking into questions of space. I thought I was just unique or maybe odd, that I was impacted by this space and I didn't know why. Come to find out that actually spatial theorists have thought about this. One of the most impactful ways that I came to think about this was what Doreen Massey talks about, where she says that all space is created by the sum total of everyone taking part of that. So if we apply that to this room, we're actually doing this right now. You may not even realize this, but we're all forming conceptions of this space we're in. And they might be pretty similar, right? This is a fairly low stakes environment. It's an academic building. We've been in academic buildings and classrooms before. But if I went to interview everyone after this, we'd probably have a slightly different perspective. You know, was there a smell you picked up on? Was the lighting a certain way, you know, based on your individual background? And that may seem fairly obvious, but when we apply it to something like Treblinka, we see that you have a high stakes implication here, because you have to understand that it was not just the Jews who could understand this space or the Germans who built it, but the local Polish people. And so the first thing my project really does, I try to put those voices in conversation with one another. I privilege the fact that everyone has a body capable of perceiving space. And we do that largely sensorially through our sights, our smells, and our sounds. And the closer we get to the truth of what Treblinka was, the more voices we actually put into conversation. So that was the big challenge for me, trying to put these transnational voices together. And it's something that I think is powerful for the book, because it does this second thing. It shows that actually tens of thousands, if not more than that, witnessed Treblinka. And there's this misconception in historiography of the Holocaust that we don't know these camps, that no one witnessed them. They were so far into the wilderness that they were hidden. They are really black holes of the Holocaust where millions of people went and disappeared. That was the Nazis' goal. They wanted to make these things isolated and kind of restricted. But by actually going out into the surrounding areas and looking at the different trajectories where people escaped, we see that literally thousands of people witness this daily, largely through their senses, and that actually made them witnesses to this. And then if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying today, I hope it's this last one, especially when I speak to students about this. You know, so often we teach history and it's hard. We see a lot of black and white pictures and everyone thinks that, oh, the history had to happen in black and white. It actually was a vivid multisensorial reality. And when we accept that, we become a lot closer to it. And in our modern world, with everything going on, we need to understand that we're not that much different from witnesses in the past, that they smelled things, they heard things, they saw things. It's easier now to do that. Pick up your iPhone. You can actually visually witness what's going on the other half of the world from wherever you are. But that was true in 1942 and 1943. And once we realize that, we come to understand that this is a type of witnessing that we need to understand if we need to know how genocide happens. So with that set up, we go into the other real tension that I think is important with the book. And this is one I really wrestled with when I was writing the book, because I came across some very, very horrific things as I'm writing about what Treblinka was. And for me, the tension was really shown in this image that you see on the screen here. I was going through the archive and I had not come across this before, but I came across this pamphlet from 1946 that's in German. It reads The Human Slaughterhouse Treblinka. And the imagery of what Treblinka is here is very striking. We think of Treblinka as being this hidden, isolated space, but how is this projected here? Well, the camp is sitting on top of a hill instead of being isolated, and you wouldn't put something you want to keep secret on top of a hill. The buildings themselves are streamlined, modern looking. They look like modern factories. This is something that's belching industrial smoke into the atmosphere. You don't see the killing here. This looks like a clean, smooth, efficient process where the actual killing is removed from our line of sight. In fact, the only reason that this is a death camp is the disembodied faces that are floating in the clouds there, but you don't actually see the violent part of this. On top of that, you have a train chugging up towards the top, the modern means of transportation. And instead of being isolated from the world, it's connected by telegraph wires. This is at odds with what Treblinka actually was. But why do we have this imagery? And so throughout the book, I wrestle with this tension because this is the image that lives on, that Treblinka was somehow a clean industrial slaughterhouse where killing happened without getting people's hands dirty, that this was somehow an efficient way of murdering other human beings. However, repeatedly, especially from the survivors, especially from the local Poles who saw and smelled and heard this, I have a bunch of evidence showing that Treblinka was a really horrific place. The smells alone, some of the descriptions I read, I won't repeat today, they're in the book, some of them, but some were so horrific I had to leave them out of that. Treblinka was one of the worst places imaginable, and killing human beings there was a horrific, terrible, gory process. However, this is published after the war, 1946. It's one of the first German pamphlets about what Treblinka was. And I kept finding this type of imagery as I moved forward. So this has outlasted the image of what Treblinka actually was. So for example, found a 2010 article in Haaretz where they interviewed two of the last remaining Treblinka survivors. And those survivors in that article, just a couple of sentences below where they gave their testimony, they each said, don't forget what Treblinka was. We can't forget the reality. Just a couple sentences below that, the author of the article wrote, Treblinka was an efficient killing machine. 2013 documentary by Caroline Sturdy-Coles, excellent documentary. She's a great archaeologist. I learned a lot from that. It's a Smithsonian. It's really well viewed. The title is Treblinka, Hitler's Killing Machine. And I understand why that machinery language exists. This machinery language, this efficient, this kind of image here of what Treblinka, that protects our own sensibilities for looking at the gore, looking at the violence, looking behind the curtain, as it were. And that makes us feel safer, especially in our modern Western society. We don't like squeamishness. We don't like reading some of these descriptions. However, I kept reading these testimonies, even from the Germans themselves, and that was the real turning point, where they talked about how horrific this actually was. And it dawned on me, especially the survivors whose time is limited after they survive, they could have just said, oh, that person died or that person disappeared, and that would have sufficed. But they don't. They take extra space to say, this is exactly how it happened. This is what I saw. This is what I smelled. This is what I heard. And it's pretty gruesome, pretty horrific. And that's what I've asked my readers to confront in this idea that we actually need to open that curtain up and we need to look into some of those things. And we don't just do that for gratuitous violence sake. I think there's a real issue there. But we do that because when we confront that reality, we're getting closer to the truth of what Treblinka was. But on the flip side, we're actually destroying the Nazi image of what it should be. So if we rely on this image here, the idea of a machine, the idea of an efficient, clean slaughterhouse, a factory, a modern industry, well, where no one got hurt, it just disappeared. We're actually using the perpetrator's own language. That's why they shifted to death camps in the first place. They wanted it to be this. So the interesting part, I think, about my book as I'm doing these other things, I have to present the Nazi perspective first. But then with each additional chapter, with each new transnational voice I put in, Jewish people, Polish people, as I spread the lens out, it actually erodes that. It erodes the Nazi perspective of what Treblinka was. And nowhere does that really work better than sensory witnessing. And so the sensory witnessing that I mentioned before was simply the sights, the smells, and the sounds of the death camp. And why this matters, I return to it now, is it shows just how wide beyond Treblinka people could see what was going on here. So the Nazis wanted Treblinka to be hidden. They wanted it to be this clean industrial facility. That was very much their imagery that, again, I'm trying to chip away at. But you actually didn't even have to live all that close to Treblinka to see, hear, or smell it. And we often think, well, what is a witness? If you live 4 kilometers on the horizon and you see the smoke rising up, you're going to start to ask questions. Why is that there? If you smell the smoke, if that's burning bodies, which smells very specifically, that's going to change your perception of what's around there. For example, I have evidence from local polls. One, has anyone seen Shoah, the 9-hour epic film? So Claude Landsman went around the area and asked people, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell? And that was actually really good source for me. One man told him that the smell of burning bodies was unavoidable. He said it squeezed into homes through porous windows, walls, and doors of the country houses in which we lived in. Even though they lived 4, 5, 10 kilometers away, we wouldn't put them as direct witnesses. Parts of Treblinka literally infiltrated their home space. They could no longer escape it. And that only happened because they lived within a certain distance of Treblinka. In fact, Landsman later wrote in his reflection, his memoir called The Patagonian Hare, he said the peasants who lived near the camp struggled heroically not to smell. They actually changed their behavior because Treblinka was on the horizon. It actually changed their day-to-day life. But this appears to have been the norm. Another person noted that within 4 to 5 kilometers of the camp, if you lived in this radius, people would bring smelly bushes like torchwood or juniper and burn that as kind of incense to mask the smell. And as you can see in the picture here, it wasn't just the smell, it was the visuals as well. The most striking visuals at Treblinka was the burning of bodies, which again occurred over the entire span of Treblinka's 15-month existence. They were burning upwards of 10,000 bodies a day. And this would have changed what you saw on the skyline. So if you're a rural person, you live in a rural area, you're not used to waking up and looking on the skyline and seeing a big black plume of smoke. But that became your daily reality for the 15 months that Treblinka was around. Oftentimes paired with the smell if you obviously were in the direction of the wind. On top of that, though, at night, the fires would be burning. You could see the light reflected in the sky for many kilometers away. If you've ever driven at night on a lonely highway, you start to see the lights of the big city several miles before you get there, especially if it's cloudy, different atmospheric conditions. I lived in Colorado for a while, and there's a big prison in Sterling. And when we were driving on I-76, if it was a cloudy night, I could see the lights on the sky above Sterling, the big prison camp, from about 20 miles away. So it actually changes your perspective. In a rural area, you didn't have big industrial lighting in the sky, but now you do. So you're going to start asking questions of what that was like. The image that I have here that I found is from the Treblinka Revolt in 1943, where the prisoners actually revolted and blew up the camp and ran away. And this is how we have a large number of survivors. And I can talk more about the revolt during the Q&A if you want. I'm not going to speak too much about it now, but this is what just that revolt looked like from 4 kilometers away. What might it have looked like when they were burning bodies every day? To show kind of a perspective here, this was a picture taken near Majdanek, which is in Lublin. Lublin, this was about 1.5 kilometers away, so about a mile away. The city's up on a hill. In November of 1943, they had Operation Entefest, where they shot 18,000 Jews at the camp of Majdanek, and then they burned the bodies for several days afterwards. From the city, and you can see this is just a normal city dwelling situation, look how big that plume of smoke was. And so we have to imagine this was just a couple of days at Majdanek where this happened, but this was every day at Treblinka. And so I have evidence, I have testimony of people describing this type of smoke, big, black, billowing, oily smoke from 10, 15, 20 kilometers away. You could see this for quite a ways on the horizon. The other interesting part of sensory witnessing was that it wasn't just sight, which we think about, and it wasn't just smell, which we often don't even think about when we consider the Holocaust, but it was audio as well, auditory. You could hear people screaming at the camp as they're meeting confrontations with death. You could hear gunfire, but you could also hear weird sounds that wouldn't have made sense. Like they had a digger, they called it, going around, kind of an excavator, digging up bodies, and it droned on throughout the day. And people nearby were like, what is this? There's no factories nearby. Why is this sound happening? And people would go try to see what that was. But you also had oddly joyful sounds. So the Nazis did keep people alive, and their only right to live was to play music. They had an orchestra there. And this served a couple of purposes. One, they tried to drown out the sound of the killings. It wasn't very effective. But it also was just the Nazis wanted to entertain themselves. And so this was a way to do that. And the local people noticed this. One woman actually said, she's a Polish woman who happens to live nearby. She heard a hymn one morning. She woke up and the Jewish prisoners are singing a hymn from Treblinka. And she said, in the morning, as the sun rose from the camp, one could hear a loud song. It was as pronounced as someone singing in my own house. And she remembers this vividly, this idea that this beautiful sound coming from Treblinka, which is at odds with the horrific sounds. And so again, Treblinka created this incredible and incredibly diverse sensory witnessing scape. The biggest one, though, I want to go back to is the smell, because again, everyone reports this. The Jews report it, they're being targeted. The local Poles report it, but even the Germans report it. And this is where I want to transition here, because the Germans are the ones who built the camp. So they're the ones who are supposed to believe this is an efficient, clean factory of death. The smell bothers them too. So this is consistent that they even recognize how horrific the killing is here. And in fact, Franz Stangl, who's the commandant of Treblinka, he lives on site. And someone actually went and checked out his living quarters one day, and they wrote back later, they said, you know, it was really odd. He has taken a bottle of perfume and doused it all over the walls and the floors to mask the smell of Treblinka. In fact, he quoted it later. The person writing this said that Stangl lives in the perfumed hell of Treblinka. That's kind of the moniker he gave it. And it's with this example, specifically with Stangl, that we really see that tension of what Treblinka was supposed to be versus what it was. Again, Stengel's the person who's supposed to make it into this. He's supposed to turn the camp into this clean industrial killing facility. But even he is aware of just how horrific this space becomes. And so we have to step back and look at the design of the camp, because we have to understand what the Nazis wanted at Treblinka, because it's clear that people can hear it, see it, smell it, and witness it, not only in the camp, but from many, many kilometers distance. Now, here's a map of Treblinka that I want to kind of point some things out to you. And if you can't read the numbers, that's okay. I'll kind of give you some ideas here of what we're looking at. The first thing I want to point your attention to with what the Nazis tried to do at Treblinka was they were all about secrecy and isolation. And they did this for a number of reasons. The first is they didn't want the outside world looking in. They really wanted to make sure that this kind of killing was kept secret. And we know that because they built not one fence, but two fences. You see the interior fence there in red and green, and then you see another one that's separated by a little bit of a field. The outer fence is about 15 feet high, and they have made it of entangled barbed wire. And so important was it that no one could see through this fence that they actually kept Jews alive, and their only job was to replace the rotting pine branches. Literally day after day, they were called the Waldkommando, the forest team, and they would go through and pull out the dead rotting branches and put new ones in. So people called this the green fence of Treblinka. So the Nazis didn't want local people to see in this, but why did they put a second fence, and why did they divide it internally? Well, I really thought about this because I wanted to know if the Nazis believe what they're doing is correct. And they do. They think that this is for the greater good of the Thousand-Year Reich. They think that to kill Jews is actually to enhance the German Empire in the future. Why would they try to hide it? So I think they want to hide it because they know what they're doing isn't great. They understand what they're doing is bad. But they also want to make a space where they can behave in a certain way and get away with it. So if we actually break down the internal spaces of the camp here, you see the reception camp. That's where the trains came in and unloaded the Jews. Again, the Jewish workers that are kept alive to run the camp are the ones kind of helping unload. They push them down the Himmelstrasse, which leads to the gas chambers, which is number 35. And then you see the big orange blobs, which are the mass graves, where they initially buried these people before the decision was made to unearth those bodies and burn them. And you can see the grates there as well, the black kind of grids. The Jewish quarters for those about 1,000 people that are kept alive at any time are over in that part of the camp. But the Nazis themselves lived on site, and spatially, they have put themselves as far away as possible from the dirty part of the camp, from the horrific sites of the camp. In fact, Commandant Stengel in his perfumed Hell of Treblinka is in number 12 way down here, if you can see. Sorry, I know I'm not supposed to walk away from the camera, but this one right here. He has positioned himself spatially as far away as possible from the death camp part of Treblinka. So even he realizes that what they are creating here is something that probably would not be seen very well in the outside world. On top of that, this is an entirely different world unto itself. So internally, it's divided. For example, 15 and 14, they actually have a zoo. They have a petting zoo on site where the SS men can go enjoy themselves in their off time. They have barbers, they have tailors, they have access to alcohol, they have all sorts of the amenities of life. They have a garden. In fact, I've came across an image of an SS man exercising on the roads of Treblinka, and the only thing looking at this picture that you would know this isn't just some guy out running for a daily jog is in the background you can see the anti-tank obstacles, you can see the fences. The Nazis tried to carry out everyday life. In fact, Stengel said it was a beautiful existence. Literally 200 meters away, this isn't a big camp, 200 meters away, some of the worst things ever imaginable are happening. And so internally, the Nazis have created a place where they can behave in different ways. And why that matters is how we define spaces, how we create spaces determines our behavior. I don't know if you actually sat and thought about this, but when you go into a restaurant, do you behave differently than you do when you go into your own home, or when you go into work, or when you go to the grocery store, or when you go to a theater, or a religious site, a synagogue or a church or a park. You change the way you behave and act based on that space. At Treblinka, therefore, what that meant was these killers crossed into this threshold that I've called a zone of Nazi morality that has been isolated from the outside world, not just once, but twice. They have two fences, and even internally, it's further divided than that. And in that zone, they're the masters over life and death. Outside of this world, it might be the laws of Judeo-Christian morality that say you shall not kill, you shall not steal, kind of the things we think of as law and legal behavior. Once you cross the borders, if you're a Nazi or if you're a Ukrainian guard, the law holding sway inside this camp is you shall kill if it's in service of the Third Reich. And so what we see is, despite the smells, despite the sounds, despite the horrific things that are going on, Nazi and SS officers play a role in this camp. The space actually alters what they're doing. To give you just a few examples, the person in charge of the death camp area, his name was Augusta Mieta. Before the war, he was a janitor. During the T4 killing program, he was a nurse. He worked at a desk, very kind of just part of the lowly bureaucracy. He gets to Treblinka, and he's elevated to this role of you're in charge of the death camp. And he runs with it. And he becomes this brutal commandant of this area. And in fact, the post-war trials mention this. They say for the first time in his life, he was given a role of power, of authority. This person who had always been a lowly administrative person steps into this role at Treblinka, has no bounds on his behavior, and takes full advantage of it. And the result is millions of people die. After the war, he goes back to being a janitor. He simply flips the switch on and off just because he was able to cross into this threshold. And I have example after this, where the Nazis function as if Treblinka is operational from the, or shut off from the outside world. Moving beyond here, because I really want to save some time for questions. That's just a couple of the spaces, right? We have to look at what the Nazis built at Treblinka to understand it. We have to understand why they put things in the different areas, why they isolated it, why they wanted to keep it secret. As we expand the scope, though, like I've already done a little bit and said, hey, people living 10, 15, 20 kilometers away could see it, hear it, smell it. They become what I call sensory witnesses, and there's tens of thousands of those people. But the camp didn't just eject sensory things into the outside world. They ejected people as well. And so another space that happens at Treblinka is what I call an interactional space. And it's kind of multifaceted. So here's an image of Treblinka that was taken in 1944. So it's after the camp has been torn down by the Nazis. And I'm going to try something here. And I don't know if it'll work, but I'm going to try to use a laser pointer so I don't have to leave where I'm standing. We'll see how. Oh, yeah. You guys see that? Cool. So we have a reconnaissance plane that flies over Treblinka a couple of months after it's torn down. And it gives us a good idea of if a Jewish person was able to escape Treblinka. And we actually know that Jews would escape constantly, that it wasn't just during the revolt. They were frequently trying to get out of the camp. The fences weren't electrified. So if they played their cards right, they actually could escape. What would they come across? Well, to give you some reference, Treblinka was right here. This little area right here was the actual death camp. If you look to what is the east, you see heavily forested areas, very thick woods. You actually have the Boog River, which runs down here. More fields that are probably farming area. These are definitely farms. If you go to the south of the camp, more farms here. You have forests up here, but you also have people. This is that town I walked to. I walked that far. Yeah, I walked all the way. It was a lot farther than it looks on the map. About a kilometer away, you have the town of Volka. You have another town just to the north of the camp right here. You have the town of Treblinka, which is up here. So what happens is if a Jewish person escapes Treblinka, and they might have done so in a number of ways, and we can talk about that during the Q&A about how individual Jews managed to try to get out of here. They now exit into the outside world and expand the spaces of Treblinka. So for example, if they decide to go this way, their first interaction is going to be with the natural world. A lot of these Jews come from the Warsaw Ghetto. They're used to city life. They get into these outside spaces, and now they have to figure out, how am I going to survive in the elements? How am I not going to be dying of exposure? We have stories where they talk about watching the animals to see what they ate, what streams they drank from. They have to hide behind the trees and the bushes and make shelters to avoid being recaptured. And then if they want to survive long term, they have to adapt to the natural environment. So this is an adjustment. It's an interaction with the natural world. And it occurs largely at random, because Jews might have gone this way or this way or this way. And I always think about this as well. What if a Jewish person escaped the camp and went this way and ended up in this village? And I found this again and again and again, because in the fields where the farmers are working and in these houses are people. So the second half of this interactional space, it's a natural world that's actually having agency, but they interact with individual poles as well. So for example, if a Jewish person escapes here, and let's say they go to this house as opposed to this house, again, they just happen to knock on this door. That interaction that results is going to have life or death consequences for both parties. That Jewish person going to rap his knuckles on the door, perhaps in the middle of the night, may get helped. That Polish person may give them food, may give them shelter. They may be harmed. The Polish person may say, hey, wait a sec, and then call the Germans, and then they come and take them back to Treblinka and kill them. The Polish person might kill them themselves. Or, as more frequently happen, the local Polish person may be indifferent and say, you need to keep moving, I don't want any part of this. That interaction only happened because Treblinka happened to be plopped down next to someone's house. And this happened again and again and again. And I think about this all the time, because it's one of those things where those random spatial trajectories are just that. They're random, but they determine the life and death for so many people. And the Poles who try to help the Jews, the ones who are the righteous among the nations, we have 7,000 in Poland that are recognized. There are extreme laws against what they're doing, and they know that. And so the ones who then turn on Jews, or the ones who are indifferent, they know to help a Jew to do the right thing could end up with their own death, and oftentimes the death of their own families. And the Nazis make good on this. They do this several times, and the calculus is known. So I might even suggest a couple of things. One, there's a gray zone of morality existing around the camp. The idea that the Polish person should have done this, that, or the other, or should have done that, absolutely we can judge the outcome of that. But to do it broad swaths and say they all killed Jews or they all helped Jews doesn't really do it justice, because the second thing is, I don't think the individual Polish person probably had any idea of what they were going to do before that knock on the door happened. Just like the Jewish person who's knocking on the door doesn't know, am I going to get help? Am I going to get shot at? Is this going to be the end? I don't think the Polish person knows either. They're not prepared for this. So again, in this way, those people become not only witnesses, but interactive. And so this spreads the space of Treblinka, if you will, further and further. Sometimes they don't even hit a house until they go this way for 10 kilometers, and then they hit another town, or this way for 15 kilometers, hit a town. So where this goes, I have a lot of examples, but it could be even bigger than that. Another way that I really think is important to think about this, and I'm doing additional work on this now, is this was also true for the trains as well. Maybe not in the same way, but Jews were sent from Warsaw, from Białystok, which is up here, and from other places down south. And these were the major three train lines that took them to Treblinka via Małkinia. So they would, the biggest number of Jews, 450,000, came from the Warsaw Ghetto up through Małkinia and then down through here to Treblinka, right? So here's the actual camp itself, which of course is sending out smoke and smells and sounds and individual people creating those random vectors. But what about the train cars? So anyone who lives near a train track knows you get kind of very familiar with the rhythms. Has anyone been to Iowa on purpose? Oh, Kathy, all right. So I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and we had freight trains that would come through 3 times a day. And I never really thought about this until I started doing this work, but you start to rhythm your life by that. You start to make that, the 3 o'clock train, 6 o'clock train. I knew I was having a good day if I, heard the 11 o'clock train, because that means I was staying up having a good time as a little kid. Mm-hmm. In the same way, you have people living along these railway corridors, whether they're in towns, like little towns along the way, or individual houses that just abut the railway corridors that happens to run through their backyard. In 1942, they're very used to the sounds of freight trains every day, of passenger trains. They're used to the mechanical noise of daily life. In 1942, that changes. All of a sudden, a new type of train comes passing through their backyards. The Nazis use cattle cars that are rated for about 40 soldiers, and they stuff 150 to 200 Jews in those cars. They go very slow. The journey from Warsaw to Malkinia should take about 3 hours. It sometimes takes days because they're holding the train so no other trains see it. So these trains actually become what I call boxes of death. You have in August of 1942, when the big thrust of deportations happens, this is the heat of summer. There is no water in these trains. So you have Jews dying in these train cars. They are screaming for water. They are trying to break out and escape. These train cars are actually microcosms of the death camps they're serving. And they're traveling through people's backyards. They smell, they're loud. In fact, so many escape attempts happen that the Nazis have to position German guards on top with guns to shoot at them. And so I thought about this. Well, if you happen to live in this town or just a random house along any of these railway corridors, and you see this new train coming by, you're going to be implicated in that. Not only are you seeing the train, but you're hearing the shots, you're hearing the people screaming. I have evidence of people from 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers away saying, I could hear the Wasser, like we want water from the trains. You can smell the trains. These are basically rolling coffins. There's examples of trains showing up at the camp where everyone's dead from the conditions. And these are traveling through people's backyards day after day after day. And on top of that, not only are they sensorially contaminating the outside world and creating witnesses all along the railway tracks, but the people who do escape, some Jews actually jump out and they survive the fall. They somehow survive being shot at. Guess where they're going to go for help? The immediate houses that they see along those paths. So you have that same dynamic I just talked about with the camp itself, where you go to knock on the door and now you're being implicated with someone who's either going to help you, hurt you, send you on your way, and vice versa. And so in this way, we actually see that Treblinka wasn't just this small little area here, but it actually goes along these tentacular swaths of train corridors that led to it for about 18 months. And if we think about this more broadly, this was probably true for most of the railways throughout Europe. Any of the camps that brought Jews to death camps, especially in cattle cars, would have created similar witnessing moments for people living along train corridors. So I think about the trains from Drancy in France that end up in Auschwitz. A lot of those are cattle cars, and they travel broad swaths of Europe that are not just this tiny little slice of Poland. So just think about how many witnesses to these train cars we actually have. It's easily in the tens of thousands. To wrap, because I really do want to get to questions, like I said, for me, the big takeaways of this kind of research, kind of that so what question, and really why I wrote the book, was that when you put transnational voices together, you get that reality of what the camp was. So to answer my own question, which is why I wrote the book, I love that people read it and get things out of it. But for me, I just want to answer that one question of what it was. It was only once I started to put more and more voices together that I came to understand Treblinka was actually this horrible, terrible place. And that was in opposition to what the Nazis wanted it to be. I think there's a lesson there. We also see that there's a lot of witnesses. How do we define that word? In our modern world, you pick up the phone, you see what's happening across the world. I mean, are you implicated in that? In the same sense, if you are in a train, you live next to a train corridor on the Warsaw to Malkinia route, you see these new trains start coming every day. Do you habituate to that? Does that change your perception of what a train is? Very banal spaces. And then again, finally, the fact that the past is vivid, multisensorial, and the fact that witnessing maybe doesn't mean you actually see the camp or witness what's happening, although we have examples of that. But you can be implicated by saying, wow, there's a big smoke plume, it smells bad, and it's there every day. I should probably figure out what that is. And along those lines, with sensory witnessing comes knowledge creation. We have examples of knowledge traveling along these corridors, people saying, I saw the smoke, I went to figure out what it was. Turns out it's a death camp. And so the Nazis wanted to keep this a secret. They didn't want anyone to find out. we have examples in the Warsaw Ghetto in the Oynig Shabbos archive as quick as 2 weeks after the camp is operational saying that Treblinka is a death camp. So the knowledge that travels because of this shows just how important it is to understand how we translate sensorial witnessing into knowledge creation. And then finally, I hate big quotes on slides, but with a topic that's this dark, I like to end on, I don't want to call it a high note, but has anyone read Life and Fate? Vasily Grossman, my opinion, one of the great books of all time. I liked this quote so much that I actually use it as the epigraph because there really is no redeeming quality of Treblinka. It is a horrific place, and we have reason to identify that. But I like to share this because Vasily Grossman was one of the first outsiders to witness Treblinka. And in Life and Fate, he puts it in a way that really stuck with me and is kind of, I don't want to say a high note, but a thing that I like to leave on. He says, and I'll read this to you, you can read it yourself, but he says, I have seen that it is not man who is impotent in the struggle against evil, but the power of evil that is impotent in the struggle against man. The powerlessness of kindness, of senseless kindness, is the secret of its immortality. It can never be conquered. The more stupid, the more senseless, the more helpless it may seem, the vaster it is. This dumb, blind love is man's meaning. Human history is not a battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It's a battle fought by a great evil struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer. And again, that gives me hope that if Vasily Grossman, who is one of the first outsiders to come across Treblinka, can come up with this profound statement, as long as someone's doing something kind, however small, however thoughtless, then evil will never triumph. So with that, I want to thank you. I also want to share if you're interested in the book, there's a coupon code. You can scan it with your phone. It should take you to the website. There's a 40% coupon code because the University of Nebraska has been great to work with, but they choose the price and it's pretty, I don't know why they made it so expensive, but this will save quite a bit of money. And if you have questions, I know we'll do some Q&A here for I think I got 20 minutes. You can always shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Online audience, this is just a reminder to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A.
Volker's running my questions here. So.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Great presentation. Thank you. Very interesting. And my question is about memorials and what happens today. We're in the 80th anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz. A friend of mine just spoke at Mittenau, Dora, and so on. What about Treblinka? It was closed earlier, but you said 1944, I think, was when it was closed. But what's the memorial today that takes place to remember those deaths?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. So this is something that in 1943, the Nazis tore down all these death camps. At that point, Majdanek had been uncovered by the Red Army. And so the Nazis all of a sudden became worried. They knew they were going to lose the war, but they were worried these horrific places of death would fall into the hands of the Russian army. And so they start tearing down Auschwitz at that point, and they start actually dismantling it. But Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, they raze to the ground. They don't want to leave anything left. They actually put a house on there, and they install 2 Ukrainian guards to watch it so that no local people come asking questions. They flee pretty quickly. The Ukrainians do in front of the Red Army, because to collaborate with the Red Army or to collaborate with the Nazis is a crime in the Red Army. So once the Red Army comes, they leave that post pretty quick. In the intervening period, that's where Vasily Grossman comes in with the Red Army and writes about what was here. He interviews the locals. And then the locals come and dig up the ground. They dig through human ashes and bones to try to figure out if they can find any jewels or gold they think is buried in the ground. Jan Gross writes about this in Golden Harvest, about Jewish grave digging or Polish grave digging at Treblinka. That doesn't last very long because they start to realize this is pretty unsavory. And there's a gap of about 15 years before they come and put the memorial in 1964, which is still there today. It's very much a reflection of absence, the idea that how do you reflect something that's not there? And so that was the idea behind having these, and I have that image here of what it looks like today. You have a big monument where the gas chambers were. It has a menorah on it and other symbols, and you have, you know, the statement, the never again, in 7 languages that you see in a lot of places. And then each one of these markers is supposed to represent a town, village, or location where someone came from that died at Treblinka. Some of them have names on them of the town, some of them don't. Some commemorate individual people like Janusz Korczak, who was a priest who went with a bunch of children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. They ended up dying, but he kind of sacrificed himself to make sure the children had someone to be with until the end. They're actually redoing Treblinka, though. They're putting a new museum. I don't know if they're doing much to the memorial, but currently this is in flux. Because there is a museum on site, but it's a tiny little house. It's very, very interesting. Nice bookstore. They have a model of the camp, but they're actually redoing it to make it a lot bigger. So memorialization is always changing. And it's one of those things that I always wrestle with when I come to a site of memorialization. To me, this is great. It's very moving, very well done, but it's also very much for the living. It's very much for us today to reflect on this, to think about what was here. And in fact, a lot of those trees you see in the background, those were planted by the Nazis as they left. They planted these trees to try to cover the site up. So physically, the site is changed because of what the Germans tried to do to cover it up.
First, a comment, beyond great presentation, and I'm going to get that book, and I appreciate the 40%.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry that Kim Klett left, because I think one of the things that you touched on, and it's a sign of a great talk when a sort of marginal point is rich, and in addition to the main points that you're making. And this is more general to the Holocaust. I don't think it's specific to what you're doing here, but you had a really nice insight, which is that people who were quote unquote bystanders wouldn't necessarily know what they were going to do until they were in a situation. And it just struck me as we've been struggling, and Alex Alvarez has been involved in this and others, about whether genocide education has any noticeable effect on the world, whether it has any value. And it's the first time I had a clear sense, maybe in this kind of case, where people are asked to think ahead about these kinds of situations, and to maybe begin to think about what habits they want to develop in situations like this. So I thought it's a great side point, but I thought you really made that point, I think, effectively. Yeah, and then the second is, I started really thinking about the idea of different senses that you're talking about, and they're different in different ways, right? So I always think of smell. I mean, taste obviously is you're taking physical objects into your body and integrating them into your body, which is the most material. But smell is also your atoms are striking your, parts of your body and then being taken into it. And that's different from, even though sight and hearing, you have waves that are hitting you, you never touch what you hear, right? It's vibrations and the same thing with light waves, right? Unless you talk about light particles, and we won't get into that. And then touch requires direct proximity. And it seems really interesting that in this case, it's odor and odor and taste are so related anyway, that it's kind of like, I feel like if we're smelling what was going on at Treblinka, there's a sense of the taste in your mouth. People talk about that a lot because of that physical presence of actual atoms, molecules. And I'm wondering, I start thinking about denial and what we trust and what we don't trust, and the whole challenge around the Holocaust and other genocides where people wanted to preserve something so that they could compel maybe not understanding, but at least factual representation or factual knowledge. And I'm wondering, in Western philosophy, there's a hierarchy of senses. So sight is number one by far in every possible way. And then hearing is a second that's very important. And then you start going down. The other three are sort of marginal. And Carolyn Korsmeyer, as a philosopher, has actually written about this hierarchy and how taste is at the bottom and all this kind of stuff. I wonder if you can comment on this. Like, what of these different senses, what was more powerful, or what stuck with people in terms of memory? We talked a lot about memory politics. And if you can maybe unpack that a little bit in the work that you've done.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for the comment and the question, that's a very astute question. It is something I wrestle with quite a bit in the book. I don't want to say I became an expert in sensory witnessing or, the physiological. I dabbled in it. I feel like I know enough to be dangerous, but I do comment in the book on the primacy of sight and how we ascribe a lot of emotive language to what we see. But I also talk about how the other senses work differently than that. One of the things that really struck me was synesthesia, which is this idea of interpreting one sight in terms of another, and you find a lot of that, especially with people who maybe are deprived of sight. They speak about, well, I saw Treblinka because of the smells, or I interpreted it that way. But they also work differently in terms of habituation, and that was something that was something I wrestle with quite a bit. The sights, we like to think seeing is believing. Those change. Those are actually environmentally driven at Treblinka. So the idea of the smoke plume might point a different way one day on the wind, or a different way, or the atmospheric conditions may make it so if you live 15 kilometers away, on a cloudy night you can see the fire lights above on the clouds, but on a clear night you can't. And people ascribe different colors to that. If the fires are particularly intense, it's the red light over Treblinka, the glow of the red. But what I really was struck by most was the smell. I think the smell was the one that most people talk about, because it happens two ways, not to get too graphic, but the first way is, for the first several months, the Nazis bury bodies at Treblinka. And this becomes a major problem because as of about September, October, 300,000 bodies in shallow graves, and the heat starts to smell. And so people in the nearby area can smell this. In fact, Franz Stangl is brought in at this point to take over as commandant. He says you could smell Treblinka before you saw it. But you habituate to smell very quickly. And Claude Lanzmann, who filmed Shoah, was struck by this. He comments in The Patagonian Hare that he said that he was shocked when he was interviewing two local Poles who he came to realize had actually conceived their son while Treblinka was operational. So he writes about this, that they are literally having sex in an environment that is infiltrated with the smell of Treblinka. The idea that, when I go back to my apartment sometimes and I've been away for a while, I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought this smelled good, and it doesn't, right? So with connecting that to knowledge, you have to have a new smell to enter that environment, or you have to have it changed before your knowledge changes. So initially the smell drives a lot of people, but they try to adapt to it, whereas the sound is usually the most frightening. Vasily Grossman picks this up. He says the villagers of Volka, that town that I walked to, would run out of their houses a couple times a day because the screaming would hit or the shooting would hit, and it would startle them. And so they do work differently, but I think it's really interesting to kind of think about, well, how does that then form knowledge? Smell especially, people initially try to figure out what the origins are. I had a lot of testimony from local Poles who would say, well, I thought it was a dead animal. And as I started to go try to find where this is, and I realized I was getting closer to the camp, and then I understood what it was. And then the Nazis switched to burning those bodies, thinking it'll eliminate the smell, and actually creates a different smell, the smell of smoke. And you talked about the molecules, and I think that's fascinating because at Belzec especially, you have this at Treblinka too, but what is that smell composed of? Literally the atomized remains of human bodies. It's oily smoke. So that stuff enters people's houses. So now you could even have human remains now drifting 10, 15 miles away. And in Belzec, they talk about having to scrape this grime off the windows at night. That is a way that you don't even think about. You're not next to the camp, but you get literally physical components of people's bodies that are people that you would have never met. They grew up their whole life in Warsaw. You grew up your whole life, just happened to be within the realm of Treblinka. So,
Jacob, that was absolutely extraordinary. And I want to congratulate you on this talk, on the book. Your book, I'm shell-shocked a little bit. Because you are humble, but your scholarship contributes to so many different fields that are now opening or thriving. I'm just thinking, so I come from Polish-Jewish history of the 20th century, and I'm thinking about new work about rescuers becoming perpetrators, about intimate violence. about actually going into those interactions with local population.
Yeah.
And you have so much to say, and I can see how spatial methodology can tell us so much about those relationships. So big congratulations, Jacob. But quickly, a couple of questions. So you interviewed some descendants or actually people who experienced that, witnessed it in those towns. Could you tell us a little bit more about your interviews or primary sources,
Yeah.
the sources for that? And I'm especially interested for local polls.
Yeah.
And second, where do you see the field going? Where, especially, it used to be that when we fought, historiography of Treblinka would tell us only about the death camp, right? But now, where do you see that field? What's the future for the field?
Yeah, well, thank you, Anya. I really appreciate that. And I think that the spatial interactions between individuals is so important, right? We have to, not that we can't judge those things if we learn what happened, but that we have to kind of suspend automatic broad category judgment and realize that, you know, space plays a role here too, because Poles are being colonized. They don't have sovereignty over their own home. So we think of our home space as that safe space, and actually the Nazis can come in for any reason and find whatever evidence they need to convict you. And so in that environment, that changes your decision making. But the question, you know, about primary sources and what I used, I wasn't fortunate enough to be able to interview local witnesses. I wanted to. I was told several times they wouldn't talk to me, partially because I'm an outsider and they're very wary of that, especially in light of Jan Gross and Jan Grabowski, which are great works and important works, but that's kind of shut that down for me. I did get very fortunate though, because for the 9 hours of Shoah that Landsman did, Landsman was really important to this project. The 9 hours he shot, he had about 200 hours that didn't make it into the film. And the U.S. Holocaust Museum holds those. And so you can get the transcripts. And he asks the questions I would have asked of the people who actually witnessed these things. And so that was really helpful. I got really lucky too at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They hold the Emanuel Ringelblum archive, the Oyneg Shabbos, but they also have quite a bit of the Polish Extraordinary Commission, the main commission that went out from 44 to 47 and interviewed local Poles about what the Nazi period. And inadvertently, a lot of them mention sights, smells, sounds, and they don't necessarily, that's not the focal point. So that's how you know they're actually probably pretty accurate. Plus they line up with other stuff, but they're talking more about what the Nazis did and showing this, but they almost always set the tone, set the scene. And that was so fruitful for me, because if I would have interviewed them, that's what I would have been asking. So I benefited a lot from that. I also found some trials in Oksnowiec, which is the archive in Warsaw. I found trials of Ukrainian guards who left Treblinka after the war and married into the local population, changed their identities, and then were brought to trial in 1954 and actually convicted, not for crimes against killing Jews, but for collaborating with the Nazis because it was the post-war communist era. And in those trials, the local Poles and Jews testify. And as they're testifying, they're describing the sights, the smells, the sounds, the scenery, these types of things. So I was able to get what I needed from the Polish perspective by kind of going around about. Your second question, as quick as I can be, that I think that the field could do a lot more with this, right? I mean, we could potentially do this at every camp. It might get a little pedantic, but the methodology here opens up a vast new trove of not only any one of these types of witnessing, whether it's interactive spaces, whether it's the spread of knowledge, whether it's sensory space, ideological and behavioral space. This is just one camp. We could learn a lot more about Belzec, for example, where we only have 2 survivors, or, Drancy or the railway corridors all over Europe. And so I really think that this opens up a broad swath of new questions to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're at time, unfortunately. And before we thank Jacob, I would like to invite you all to the Galvin Plaza, which is right in front of the School of Music, for a performance of Yellowbird Indian dancers. You've met Ken Duncan this morning. You met his wife on Monday. Right, this is a very, very lively, fantastic dance troupe, and they will perform for us at 12 at Galvin Plaza. So this is our next thing, but let's thank Jacob for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.